Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talks, the virtual series designed to provide technical assistance to residents interested in learning more about Glynn County's Superfund sites. I'm your host, Rachel Thompson. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All microphones will stay muted until we reach the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat or the comment section on Facebook Live, and we will go through each of the questions during the Q&A session. Tech Talks are brought to you by the Glynn Environmental Coalition, a nonprofit organization founded in the 1990s by concerned citizens wanting to know how our community became so polluted, why we continue to have high levels of health-threatening pollution, and how an action plan could be developed to correct the problem. The fact that you're listening in today means that you share the concern and interest of our founding members, and we're extremely grateful for your participation. Today, the Glynn Environmental Coalition is presenting episode 6 in our virtual series. In our earlier episodes, we've discussed what a Superfund site is, how the law that governs Superfund sites came into existence. We've also covered past and ongoing work at the Hercules 009 landfill, LCP Chemicals, and Terry Creek Superfund sites. If you haven't seen them, be sure to visit our website, glynenvironmental.org/superfund, to listen and learn. In this episode, we will present an overview of the Superfund process using local examples to help define keywords and terms. Specifically, we'll share the history and background of the Brunswick Wood Preserving Site to describe the main steps in the Superfund cleanup process. And we have our technical advisor, Frank Anastasi, here today as well, who may provide input throughout the presentation or during the Q&A session. There are many steps in the Superfund process. So what are they? If you were searching for graphics showcasing the Superfund process, Google will populate an overwhelming number of images. Without the appropriate narrative or accompanying descriptions, it can be confusing and overwhelming for citizens to understand these graphics. Over the years, through our community involvement initiatives, the Glynn Environmental Coalition developed this graphic that showcases 6 main steps in the Superfund cleanup process. Now, it is important to remember that this graphic is a simplification of the Superfund process. However, we believe that understanding these main steps is one of the first actions a citizen can take to enhance their ability to meaningfully engage in the decision-making process at a Superfund site in your community. So let's start from the beginning. Once a site is designated a hazardous waste site or becomes listed as a Superfund site, the first step is the remedial investigation. Now, we do typically try not to use acronyms, but for the remainder of this video, we will be referring to the United States Environmental Protection Agency as the EPA. For each step, we'll provide the EPA's definition if they have one available. These definitions can also be found in the Superfund glossary available at the agency's website shown on the screen. So the EPA definition for remedial investigation is an investigation intended to gather the data necessary to determine the nature and extent of problems at the site, establish cleanup criteria for the site, identify preliminary alternative remedial actions, and support the technical and cost analysis of alternatives. Now, what does that mean? The first step to correcting environmental problem is defining what it is. What are the chemicals that we are concerned about? Where is the pollution? Is it in the groundwater, the soil, nearby rivers or marshes? How much is there? Are there areas that have more or less? And what are the risks, meaning we need to be thinking about how people may or may not be exposed in the future. To provide an example of remedial investigation, we're going to take a look at Brunswick Wood Preserving Superfund site. And before we dive into the technical details, we do want to make sure that we are all aware of where the site is and how it got there. The site is located off of Perry Lane Road, pretty much near the center of Glynn County, Georgia, about 1.5 miles north of Interstate 95, exit 36. Just going to be right here on the map. And about 2.5 miles east of the unincorporated community Sterling, which is not pictured. The Brunswick Wood Preserving Site housed wood treatment and preserving operations from 1958 to 1991. Regular use of chemicals such as creosote, pentachlorophenol, and copper chromium arsenate contaminated the site's groundwater and soil and required long-term cleanup. And you can see the cleared area on the photo. There is railroad tracks on this portion of the right-hand side of the picture. And Perry Lane Road is the road that kind of cuts across the middle left-hand side of the picture. The remedial investigation for the uplands of Brunswick Wood Preserving was released in June 1988. Because of the age of the document, the figures that we have are not great, but we'll take a look at a few. So remember, the remedial investigation, we're trying to better understand and define the environmental problem at the site. The first figure here is the arsenic concentrations in the soil at the site. You can see the soil sampling locations and define boundaries of where arsenic pollution is located. Next, we have a figure showing where the groundwater contamination boundaries exist on the site. A plume, in this instance, is defined as a body of groundwater that is polluted. You can also see here some of the locations where wells are located. That's going to be where some of those smaller triangles are located. And I do apologize. Again, this is not a great picture, and it can be small depending on what kind of device you might be looking at the photo on. If you were to look into the 300+ pages of the remedial investigation, you will find all of the sampling results for all soil samples and groundwater samples that were collected, all of the various chemicals that were tested for, all of their results, and tables and figures like the ones shown here. This information is all compiled into the remedial investigation, and then it's used in the next step of the process, which is the feasibility study. The EPA defines this as a study of hazardous waste, of a hazardous waste site that is intended to evaluate alternative remedial actions from technical, environmental, and cost effectiveness perspectives, and also recommend the cost effective remedial action and prepare a conceptual design, cost estimate for budgetary purposes, and a preliminary construction schedule. Again, there's a lot included in that definition, so let's break it down. So really what a feasibility study is answering the question of how can we clean this up? What are the cleanup technologies, or what the EPA refers to as alternatives, available to clean up the site? And depending on where the contamination is, so whether it's in water, surface water, groundwater, soil on the site, what chemicals are there, whether it's mercury or benzene, there's all going to be different types of technologies that are available to clean up the site. So we want to look at all of those. What is feasible to clean up the site? And then they will take a look and they'll compare the technologies, the costs, and the potential for reducing risk. And specifically, they're looking at reducing risk of exposure to humans and also ecological risks. So are there risks to mammals, birds, and other wildlife in the ecosystem? Okay, and so we want to give an example of a feasibility study, again, from Brunswick Wood Preserving. Again, this document is going back to 1999, so this is a little old. And what we can see here is this is for what we call Operable Unit 1, which is the uplands. So that's going to be the soils and the groundwater at Brunswick Wood Preserving. And you can see that they have some different response actions. So no action, institutional controls, containment, removal, treatment, or disposal. They have the technologies kind of defined in the next column, and then different options. I think it says process options there. So that's table 3.1. As you move forward into the feasibility study, they kind of break it down. And you can see here, they've kind of elaborated on these different alternatives. So with the no further action, they've got media monitoring and conducting periodic reviews, capping, land deed restrictions, fencing, things like that. And they go through. And you'll notice here that they kind of combined some of those. I think we had about 5 actions, response actions here. 1, 2, 3, actually 6. And then we've boiled it down to 4, but there's a little bit of overlap. And then as we continue to move forward, that same report, there's typically a table at the end that compares the different alternatives. And so for this area of the site, they've got 4 different alternatives that they compared, including the overall protection of human health and the environment, rating it from 0 to 5 in terms of its effectiveness, long-term effectiveness, short-term effectiveness, implementability, which means how easy is it to implement. These scores are on average pretty high, but in some cases it can be very low if it's very difficult. So for example, if you lived in an area that maybe had a lot of hard rock, a cap might not be a good option because it might be difficult to put a cap in an area that has a lot of hard rock or surfaces underground, or in a marsh, for example, a very wet environment. And then, of course, the cost. So there are some approximate costs listed there. And all that information is presented in that feasibility study, and it helps the EPA and the general public start to understand what cleanup technology should move forward to the next phase of the Superfund process. And that phase is going to be the proposed plan. The EPA defines a proposed plan as a Superfund public participation fact sheet that summarizes the preferred cleanup strategy for a Superfund site. The plan briefly summarizes the alternatives that were studied in the analysis phase of the remedial investigation and the feasibility study, so the past 2 phases that we just talked about. So the proposed plan will summarize that, highlight the key factors that led to identifying the preferred alternative. And so again, we're going to kind of break this down a little bit. So the preferred alternative to the EPA is basically their recommended cleanup method. So when the EPA announces their proposed plan, they're saying, this is our preferred method of cleanup at the site, and they are presenting it to the general public. And during this time, there is a public comment period or public participation opportunities. Typically, we will have public meetings, which is kind of more of an informal opportunity for the public to learn about what's going on at the site or the proposed plans that are being presented. There will be a public hearing, which is where citizens are allowed to present verbal public comment. And then there's also a public comment period, which usually is a minimum of 30 days. However, we can request additional time. And that gives citizens or stakeholder groups, local elected officials, time to submit comments, either in favor or to provide technical feedback on the plan that's being proposed. All right, and yeah, I just mentioned the public meeting. Okay, so an example of the proposed plan for Brunswick Wood. I mentioned earlier that Brunswick Wood does have two what we call operable units. So the cleanup was separated into two parts. The first part is the uplands, and the second part is actually the ecological risks in Burnett Creek. And the proposed plan, just for sake of discussion, was only about 14 pages long for Brunswick Wood. And the reason why I bring that up is because, again, the definition for the EPA, it is a public participation fact sheet. So these documents are really intended to be comprehensible by the general community. However, sometimes they do end up being longer. So for example, this summer we had a public proposed plan that was about 50 pages. So that was definitely on the longer side. And we do, we do really need the EPA to keep these simple so that they're more easy for people in our community to comprehend and understand. This is a very important part of our public participation. So this one here is a proposed plan for cleanup at Operable Unit 2. Again, probably on the screen, it's pretty small, but you can see there's got some information about public comment period, public meeting, some of the site contacts, so who you might ask for questions for about the site. And then if we go through the proposed plan, which again, this one was only about 14 pages long, we get to the end and the document details the EPA's preferred alternative. So for Brunswick wood preserving, and this was about in 2012, I believe, if we go back, I'm pretty sure, yeah, June 2012. This was released. They proposed no further action for Operable Unit 2 at the site. And so what their proposed action was no action, no additional action in the creek, in Burnett Creek. And then you can see here, this was also taken from the document where the EPA is asking for input. It says your input on this plan is important in helping EPA select appropriate cleanup actions. However, of course, in this case, they were selecting no action. And that does happen sometimes during this process. All right. After the public comment period with the proposed plan, we move into the record of decision. And the EPA defines the record of decision as a public document that explains which cleanup alternative will be used, okay? So just a short little recap. We have defined the problem. We looked at all of the feasible solutions to the problem. The EPA proposed their preferred solution. And now this is when the EPA is actually selecting their cleanup alternative. The record of decision is a legal, technical, and public document that identifies the selected remedy, outlines the process that will be used, the process that was used to reach the decision, and confirms that the decision complies with Superfund law. So this is their final determination of the EPA, of their cleanup plan, what they're going to be moving forward with. There is typically public comment periods and public meetings during this process as well. All right, and we are going back to Brunswick Wood and back to Operable Unit 1, which was the site soils and groundwater at the site. The record of decision here, you can see some of the different alternatives: no action, capping, in situ site treatment. So they outlined all of these alternatives that we saw in the feasibility study earlier. And then at the very end of the document, they have the summary and their selection. So it says very plainly, EPA has determined that alternative S2 and G2 constitute the best overall remedial actions for the site. And you can see just behind that S2 is capping with construction of subsurface barriers, which we're going to show some pictures of that in a minute. And G2, which is also capping with construction of subsurface barriers. We didn't get too into the nitty-gritty of this, but the reason why there's S2 and G2 is just basically there's two different areas on the site that they were talking about cleaning up. That's why there's two different alternatives, but it's the same technology on both sides of the site. And we're going to look at that now, because we're going to look at the remedial action plan. Okay, so EPA has selected their cleanup. So the remedial action plan is the actual construction and implementation phase of a Superfund site cleanup. There's a remedial design phase of this. And so basically, they will design and plan the cleanup. So what does this mean? Construction, design for the cleanup, and plan for implementation. And this includes very, very detailed information about how to perform each and every aspect of the cleanup process. These are probably the most lengthy documents in the whole Superfund cleanup process. Okay, so we're going to get into an example, and we're going to look at Operable Unit 1, and we've got a number of pictures for Brunswick Wood. So this is a small example, and remember we had capping and construction of a barrier. So you can see on the screen, we've got some areas that have been identified, and there's this dashed line is the barrier that they're going to construct around that area. And then we've got some over here as well on the left-hand side of the screen. So you can kind of see the dashed line. Yeah, okay. You can see my mouse on the screen. Good. So this was the first remedial design for Brunswick Wood. And unfortunately, they had to do more work. So a few years later, that initial design, I think, was about 2002. And then this one, I think, was around 2010. So you can kind of see some of those initial spots got bigger. So they had to go back and do more work. And that was a few years later. And you can definitely tell that the drawings got better in that time as well. And then we have the last one, which was the most recent, which was about in, I think, 2016. But you can see again here, we've got some additional drawings and concepts of work being performed at the site. And on this side, you can see this is the rail lines, and there's actually some work that's being performed on the other side of the rail lines. And then here we've got work being performed outside the boundary of the site, and this is Perry Lane Road, and actually coming underneath the road and crossing the road. And when we do our Superfund field trips, that's something that I actually point out to people, is you can actually see where they cut holes in the pavement and they put those walls underneath. And again, we're going to show you some pictures of that remedial action. But you can see they kind of had to continue to add to the remedies. So there's actually been 3 separate cleanup actions at this site over the years. All right. And then the last phase, and again, this is, Glynn Environmental Coalitions, we kind of boiled it down into 6 phases. And the last one for us is the cleanup and monitoring. And there's still a lot included in this section, but we do, we feel like once we have reached this step, we have been successful. We have gotten cleanup implemented in our community, and we are now in the monitoring or operations and maintenance phases. So obviously the cleanup is actually implementing some of those cleanup activities, and we'll show some pictures of that at Brunswick Wood here in a minute. Operations and maintenance, that is site activities that are associated with a remedy that will be performed after the cleanup is put in place. So just as an example, if you have a cap that's like a soil cap, Something as simple as maintaining the grass cover is included in operations and maintenance. Maintaining fences, maintaining the groundwater wells, making sure that they're locked and they're not falling apart, and other things like that. Any groundwater treatment operations that are on site, that's all included in that. And then before we move on, just want to make sure that cleanup, according to EPA, doesn't always mean removal. And I do think that's a pretty common misconception when it comes to Superfund cleanups. A lot of times people think cleanup means that they're going to remove everything, but sometimes it does mean containment. And so that primarily is what they've done at Brunswick Wood Preserving. They've contained material on site. And any waste left behind requires consistent monitoring. All right, and so we've got some pictures. And one thing in terms of cleanup activities and that monitoring during the cleanup activities, they are required to have daily logs, and that includes photo logs. So every single thing that they do in a day, they have to report to the EPA. And typically those are contractors that are doing the work and they're reporting it to the EPA. So this here is a trench that was dug to install what we call a slurry wall. A slurry wall is essentially a reinforced concrete wall that is built to prevent water from flowing through or moving. And so we showed some of the diagrams of the contaminated groundwater earlier. And so essentially they're building these concrete reinforced walls around that groundwater contamination to make sure that it doesn't migrate off-site. So you can kind of see that they're pouring concrete slurry into the trench that they've dug. And there's another picture of it there, and you can kind of see that the trench has been more filled. This is a picture of the other side of the site, and they had there's actually two different machines here. The one in the back that's got this is actually they're using that to there was some limestone or clay that they had to puncture to get the slurry wall as deep as they wanted it to. And there's a lot of pictures of that. And then there's some power lines. And if you kind of look through some of the daily logs of the remedial activities, there's lots of pictures that look just like this. Big machinery and lots of dirt moving around. And then last but not least, we got a picture of Burnett Creek. So there was some work that was done on Burnett Creek throughout the 3 phases of cleanup at the site. And this is one area that they restored. This is a before picture, and this is at low tide. And this is the after picture, and you can see kind of where they restored this bank, that they put some riprap up, and now we're at high tide. I do wish that they had done both pictures at low tide because I'm curious what's under the water. But you can definitely tell that the bank is more stabilized in that. So just a few examples of some cleanup activities they did at the site. And last but not least, monitoring. So anytime waste is left behind at the site, 5-year reviews, extended monitoring is required. So this is a picture of a monitoring well on the site. And in 2021, we were able to go out there and assist the EPA with their monitoring. And so you can see the monitoring well cap is open, and they've got depth measurement there with the well, it's not a ruler, but the measuring tape, yard tape. And then they've got the water line kind of coming out. So they're slowly pumping water out. So they're doing some groundwater monitoring. And all of that went into the third 5-year review, which came out in August of 2022. And this isn't a great picture, but it is some of the data that they collected during that groundwater monitoring event. And the pictures that I took were from over at this monitoring well. And you can see they took samples at all of these different wells. And they have a legend over here. So for the circles, that is the total semi-volatile organic compounds in the groundwater. So the bigger the dot it is, the more SVOCs were there. So we got some pretty big dots over here that are on the other side of the CSX transportation or the CSX rail line. So there's definitely still some groundwater contamination offsite here. And then we've got naphthalene, which is shown by the color of those dots. So the more red the dot is, the more naphthalene there is. And so there is also some naphthalene still present on the outside of the site there. So definitely monitoring still needs to take place at this site. That concludes the presentation portion of our program today. Before we end the live stream, please take note of the contact information on the screen so you can follow up with questions later. If you want to learn more about Glynn County Superfund sites or the Superfund process, don't forget to watch our other Tech Talk episodes or visit our website at www.glynenvironmental.org/superfund. Thank you again for joining, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.